The World Travel and Tourism Council estimates that the tourist sector accounted for 10.2% of the world's GDP in 2016, and that it employed almost 300 million people. At a global level, the sector is predicted to grow at a rate of 3.9% annually in the years to come. For many small island states in the Pacific, the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, the tourist sector dominates the economy, generate the bulk of its foreign exchange earnings, and may contribute up to 50% of its employment. For many small island states, the limited availability of institutions with sufficient capacity to educate the human resources required to develop the sector has resulted in limited employment of nationals, especially in managerial positions. Research from Zanzibar shows that Zanzibaris hold only 11% of managerial positions in restaurants, 40% in hotels. But 83% of unskilled jobs in hotels and 70% in restaurants are held by Zanzibaris. Overall, it has been estimated that only about half of all employees in the sector are Zanzibaris, and senior positions in international-owned hotels are mostly held by experts or individuals from the mainland Tanzania. A study from Zanzibar published in 2015 found that only 20% of the GDP generated by tourism occurred to local communities. 15% went to government in the form of taxes and 12% to Zanzibaris from outside the local community. Non-Zanzibaris from mainland Tanzania or other countries obtained 53% of tourism GDP. However, this distribution varied greatly depending upon different types of tourism. So it seems possible to develop a form of tourism with greater benefits to the population of Zanzibar, including local population. Another study found that fishing grounds and fishing gear were often destroyed through development of tourist infrastructure and tourist activities. It was concluded that over the past 20 years of tourism development on Zanzibar, the living conditions among the local fishers had remained poor. Employment in the tourist sector has not been an option for the fishermen because of their low educational background. A review of evidence published by Dr. Hurtado from the Department of Economics, University of Chile, concluded in the case of Zanzibar that although tourism had brought benefits such as foreign exchange earnings, employment opportunities, and infrastructural development, it had also caused negative impacts, including social problems, environmental degradation, and conflicts between investors and local communities over the use of natural resources. To learn more about the economic and social implications of tourism in Africa and the policy options that may be available to increase the benefit to the local community, I've interviewed Stig Jensen, a researcher from the Center for Africa Studies at the University of Copenhagen. We see a massive increase in number of international arriving tourists. From your perspective, what are some of the benefits from large numbers of international tourists from Asia, North America, Europe, arriving into East Africa?
I think there's a lot of benefits here. And I think, as you sort of said, there's these trends of growing number of tourists. And I think it's also important here that we're not just talking about tourists as tourists, but sort of saying that there's a growth of tourists from the north, from the global north. But now there's also a growing number of tourists coming from the global south, and especially sort of tourists coming from Africa, both domestic tourists but also regional tourists there. If we talk about the sort of the benefits, because I think there's a number of benefits here. First of all, there's a lot of benefits in related to economic activities, because these tourists, they all bring money. And of course, the straightforward benefit is around sort of hotels, accommodation side, but also around sort of food, restaurants and things like that benefit. But there's also a number of other benefits to other people or other institutions that service tourists. That could be from taxi drivers, that could be from guides, that could be from shopkeepers. I see lots of benefits for people in those areas, both in the urban areas but also in rural areas.
Do you know why, from a political perspective, it's become a a favorable sector for investment and policy development? Is it at pair with other sectors seen from the perspective of these countries?
First of all, I think for many of the states in Africa, and especially in Eastern and Southern Africa, they see that that's one of the areas where they can get foreign currency. And that's what they actually need. And for some countries in East Africa, for example, Uganda, tourism is actually the biggest income of foreign currency. So therefore, it's important for them. And what you can see, and what we have seen in recent years, is that governments in Africa have sort of increased focus on tourism because they look very much on the possibility to earn money. But they also see tourism as a way to sort of modernize society, because they also see that tourism can link up with expanding infrastructure and other activities there. So it links well up to other things, for example, the transport sector and other things where they want to modernize the society. And what we see in East Africa is a growing number of investors going into this area. And when we talk about investors, it's important to sort of say that there's investors, international investors, but there's also national investors. We see a growing middle class in East Africa. And for many of these people in that middle class and the economic elite, it's very lucrative to invest in tourism.
They say that the profit left behind in these countries are relatively small. Is that something you would agree with?
I think it sort of depends on what type of tourism we are talking about. If we talk about what I would call the mass tourism, of tourists going to beach areas, especially north-south tourism, what we see there is that there's very little benefit for local communities apart from the jobs. Because as you said, a lot of the flow of money go via tour operators in the global north. And what we also see is that a lot of the food that these tourists eat is also where main part is actually imported. But I think with the new South-South tourism, it's very different, because many of these tourists, which could be from urban areas in those countries that go to rural areas, often they stay in small hotels owned by people from either the national elite or in cooperation with people in the local elite. And they also buy food and other things from people, and they eat some of the same things that local people produce and eat. So in that way, there's actually much more benefit in relation to what I call South-South tourism.
Civil society organizations and advocates for sustainable tourism have demanded for more attention to be paid to working conditions within the tourist sector, including greater protection of the civil rights of staff, greater degree of formalized employment, and prevention of harassment and discrimination. The disparity in employment is also reflected in the wider benefits derived from tourism. Despite the efforts of governments, the tourist sector too often has few linkages with the local economy and mainly serves the economic interest of wealthy investors. Thereby, it has a limited impact on poverty reduction and inclusive growth. I have an opportunity to talk to you about some of the cultural or some of the potential conflicts or some of the divides that may be introduced from developing tourism on a place like Zanzibar. Do you know something about this?
Tourism is an area where, you have benefits in a local community. Some people benefit from these things, they get jobs and things like that. But what you also see is that it's only some people in a society. Mainly it's actually the youth who benefit from these things there. But at the same time, there's problem with trickle down, and there's also a number of costs for the rest of the community, because often what you see in those communities is that prices is rising on sort of normal commodities and things like that. So you have a situation of inequality in that particular area, and that creates tensions among people in the rural communities there. So what we see is more and more tension around these things. Then there's another thing that is related to, for example, some of the things that tourism come with. That is, for example, some of their cultural values. For example, being half naked. That is also a problem in those communities because tourists are seen as very successful. Some of the youth copy them. with going half naked. It could also be that they start drinking, which is not necessarily acceptable. There could also be a number of things in relation to prostitutions, for example. All these things is actually side effects of tourism that create tension in communities that are linked up to tourist activities.
So looking at some of the national tourist plans, they are looking at number of tourist arrivals. How could we, in addition to looking at the number, increase the value of each tourist arriving into a country?
I think there it will be very good to use the experience from, for example, the Seychelles. The Seychelles have had a sort of a policy where they say, we don't want a huge number, but we actually want that the tourists that come actually bring some money to the society. And the way they do it is taxation. So I think a very good instrument will here be different types of taxation here, where you, with the money, actually also have the whole issue of distributing the money. So the next step will be not only to get more money out of the tourists, but also to distribute the money from the tourists into the society in the right way. And at the same time, making investments with some of those money, for example, in relation to fresh water, where you could sort of say, okay, we need to invest in different way of reuse, for example, the water, waste management and things like that, and use some of the money for those things.
What about restricting building of hotels to only very 5-star hotels instead of 2-star hotels? Is that a way forward?
I think we should be very much aware of that the diversity is also very important, because if we talk about 5-star hotels, what we often have a problem in relation to 5-star hotel is that most of the money that is paid for people staying in 5-star hotels actually stay outside the particular area. So it's not necessarily the way to do it as just to build more 5-star hotels.
At one of the largest conferences held by the United Nations World Tourist Organization in Jamaica, November 2017, the Jamaican Minister of Tourism, Edmund Bartlett, stated, "Although the Caribbean is open for business, it cannot continue to be business as usual in the Caribbean." The Caribbean region is home to the top 13 countries most economically dependent upon tourism and need to find a model for future tourism development that protects the environment and benefit the population at large.